Hello and welcome back to Threads of Fate. I am your host, Kira Ryberg, and today we're going to be diving into the houses, which has been a obsession of mine for a very long time, honestly, but I have been extra jazzed about them lately because I just released a guidebook on the houses, which is basically a 192-page deep dive. And as I released this, I was like, why not do a podcast episode about it? So this is actually going to be a little bit of a bonus episode. So you'll get this episode today on Tuesday, which is our usual release date, but you are going to get the September forecast as well this week. So luckily for you, we are getting two episodes. Now, let's talk about the houses, right? I think the houses are kind of what separates the beginner astrologer from the person who is a little bit more serious about learning astrology, because you can know the planets and you can know the signs, but the houses start being a whole nother thing that you have to add into your toolkit, right? It is not just 12 extra things, but there are so many significations assigned to each house that it starts being where you have to take it a little bit more seriously. You have to spend time to learn it. So it tends to separate, the people who just are a little bit more casual in their interest in astrology and the people who really want to take it to the next level. And so I'm always here for the people who want to take things to the next level. So we're going to talk about the houses. This is going to be a little bit of a technical episode because I'm going to tell you guys kind of not just what the houses are, but what their significations are and how they got their meanings in the first place. Because I think that is kind of one of the things that really helps illustrate why they mean what they mean. It's like, it's nice to know that maybe the fourth house is home or family or private life, but it's like, where does that come from? And I think that gives us a lot of context that also deepens our understanding of astrology as a whole, honestly. So the houses are the part of the chart where life is lived. You can know that you have the sun in Aquarius, but if that sun is placed in the first house or the ninth house or the sixth house, that is going to express in a very different way because it's going to show up and manifest in a different area of life. So one of the common metaphors that is often used with the houses is that the planets are the actors, the signs are kind of like the role or the energy that the actor is embodying, and the houses are the stages. They're going to tell you which areas of life certain planetary alignments are going to manifest through. So if you do have, for example, the sun in the first house, that's going to show up as your self-image and your identity being related to your appearance, to your core priorities, to your body, right? To the topics that we find in the first house versus someone like me who has their sun in the ninth house is going to have a lot of their self-image and self-concept, baked into and steeped into the themes that we find in the ninth, which are foreign places. I live abroad, which is astrology. I'm an astrologer, right? You can see the ways in which I think about myself as connected to the ninth house because my sun lives there, which is very different than any other house in the chart. So it's how we start getting really specific about what the houses mean. And that specificity to me is where astrology starts getting really juicy because it stops being generalizations, right? It's kind of like this thing if you can say that, all Aquarius suns are XYZ. And then a lot of people are going to be like, well, no, not me, though. That's not how it shows up for me. And that's because you have so many different factors, but one of the key ones is where your sun is placed in the chart. That is going to change everything. And so learning about the houses is a way to go a lot deeper, but also to step out of generalizations and into specifics. When I first learned about the houses, I felt like I saw myself in the chart for the first time. I was like, oh, like I have my sun and my moon and my Mercury in the ninth house, and I live abroad. I married a foreigner. I always wanted to do something that was about philosophy or writing, publishing. And then I got really into divination and tarot and astrology. And I was like, this is specific to me. This isn't something that you could say to someone else and they would be like, yeah, that matches. And I think houses are where we start getting to that point of like, ooh, this can't be applied to everybody else. And so I think it just gives your astrology something that you can't find through just signs and planets. Now, we're going to just do a quick overview of the houses, and I'm going to contradict myself because I think that using keywords for houses is a great starting point for learning what they mean and a terrible ending point. because keywords kind of box us into a very, very condensed version of what a house signifies. And it keeps us in a place that can get exclusionary, right? Like, for example, the 10th house is commonly said to signify career. That's the usual one keyword that we give to the 10th house. Well, there's a lot of people who don't have careers. What about everyone who's retired, right? What about people who are disabled and can't have a career? You know, there are ways in which the 10th house is still going to show up in their lives, and it's going to have nothing to do with career at all. And so I think when we stick to keywords, we get really exclusionary, which is what my guidebook is all about. It's like, let's go beyond keywords. Let's talk about the stories that live in each part of the chart. But to contradict myself, to give you guys an overview, if you don't know anything about the houses, I'm going to give you some keywords as a starting off point. And then we're going to talk about how the houses got their meaning and what houses are considered to be more beneficial and supportive and which ones are a little bit more challenging. And then we're going to get to my secret sauce, which is talking about the dynamics that show up between houses, which is where I think life really starts to show up in the chart in a way that is just utterly fascinating. So, the first house. In Hellenistic astrology, each one of the houses had a name that was given to it. And the first house was called Helm. Helm referred to the steering device on a ship. The Hellenistic astrologers loved a nautical metaphor. And so they used the ship of life as a way to kind of define which roles different rulers had over the life. And so the helm being the first house, this is the direction that you are steering the ship of your life in. It represents the planets who are at the wheel. And it also is yourself. It is the most you part of your entire chart, which is not what we are often taught in pop astrology, where people say the rising sign, the first house, is kind of like the mask that you wear. Absolutely not. I reject that with every fiber of my being. The first house is the most you part of the entire chart. It talks about your self-expression. It talks about your core priorities. It talks about who you truly are and how you present that not only to the world, but to yourself. It is your identity. And whatever sign is on the first house, whatever your rising sign is, whatever planet rules the first house, whichever planets are placed there, are going to have a massive, massive impact on how you show up in the world, how you navigate the world, and where you steer that ship of life towards. So the first house is self, and it is also health. It's your vitality. It is the combination of body and spirit. Now, the second house was called the Gates of Hades in a very ominous sort of way. And it talks about the themes of self-support. It literally rests underneath the second house. So it is all of the things that help support and provide for the body and the self that we find in the first house. So most commonly, the keyword that is given to it is money and personal resources and possessions. And it is all of those things, but it's also everything that you consume, everything that you take in. It is nourishment, it is food, it is content that you consume. It's everything that can either help or hinder the self that we find in the first house. So the second house is going to speak to all of our resources, and those are vast. They're not purely financial, but we live in a society that is going to constantly tell us that money should be the main focus, the priority. And one of the kind of secret significations of the second house that I really love, it comes from Vedius Valens, who was a 2nd century astrologer. So literally one of the earliest texts that we still have access to. And he actually put community in the second house. And I just think that's really beautiful because community is literally such a resource, right? Your friends, the people around you, they can truly lift you up. They are a way that we can tap into abundance that is relational, that is not monetary, but they take care of and support the self that we find in the first house. And so that's one of the ways in which you can just start going a lot deeper. And in the guidebook, I talk about all of the significations that I could pretty much find that are ascribed to the houses throughout the tradition. And you're going to get some from the 2nd century, some from the 9th century, some modern day significations. So you get a complete and whole picture of what each house really represents and how it has not necessarily changed since ancient times, but how it has morphed and evolved as society has progressed. Now, the 3rd house was called Goddess, which we love. And it most commonly was said to represent your siblings and your relatives, but it is also just your local area. It's your chosen habits and your routines. It's your route to work. It's the stuff that you engage with and interact with on an everyday basis. So it's transportation, it's your car, it's your early learning environment. It is all of the things that are kind of just around you. And so by virtue of being close by, you interact with them a lot more, right? So it's like your daily writing practice. It's your siblings because they're near you, right? It's the friend who lives down the street. It's the barista that makes your coffee. All of those people and all of the places that you inhabit on a regular basis are of the 3rd house. Those are kind of some of the significations of that place. Now, the 4th house was called subterranean, and that was because the sun moved through this part of the chart around midnight, and that is the darkest time of night. So the sun was said to be beneath the earth, right? From at least our kind of perspective. And so, subterranean, not sub terra, is Latin for beneath the earth. And this is the part of the chart that represents your family, notably, usually the father, your living situation, and your private life. And in some sources, they also say that it is where mystical matters are, which I love that. There is kind of like an occult, magical, mystical vibe to the 4th house as well, because it holds and contains that which occurs under the dark of night. And normally when you are doing magic or engaging in mystery traditions, you're not doing it in broad daylight, right? For a variety of reasons. The 5th house was called Good Fortune. And it is said to represent most notably children, but it is also creativity. It is where our hobbies lie. It's sex and romance and dating. It is really the house of pleasure and desire. And we're going to get into why that is in a little bit, but it is the things that bring good fortune into your life, right? It's the things that feel better on a baseline level and where you can kind of find happiness and fulfillment in the chart. The 6th house is called bad fortune. So we're seeing a theme here. We go from good fortune to bad fortune. And that represents illnesses and injuries. And then more in the modern day context, it's become about wellness. And that's not wrong. But more often than not, it's going to speak to the things that we are trying to do to prevent illnesses and injuries. But that is still kind of the crux of what this house is about. It's also work, it's jobs, it's caretaking, it is pets, it is the day in and day out responsibilities and obligations that we have as humans, which means it's the never ending to-do list. I often call the 6th house the house of the grind. It is where I think a lot of our effort and energy is expended on a daily basis, and it tends to speak more towards unpaid, unappreciated, or underpaid forms of labor. So parenting is like a 6th house pursuit, in my opinion. I always say we make the baby in the 5th and we parent in the 6th. Right? It is unpaid labor. Just like internships go in the 6th house, menial labor, a lot of times people who are not paid appropriately, those are 6th house jobs, 6th house activities, because they are not necessarily lifted up by society. And that is where we find bad fortune, right? The name of the house. The 7th house was called setting because quite literally when the sun moved through this part of the chart, it was setting. And it represents partnerships. And the most notably, it represents our romantic partnerships. It was said to specifically speak to the spouse or the marriage partner. But I have seen many people who are in polyamorous relationships and their partnerships in general show up through the 7th house. Can also be kind of your best friendships, people who you have a really intimate one-on-one relationship with. And it can also speak to business partners and open enemies. So it is both the lovers and the haters are in the 7th house. Then we get to the 8th, and in the Hellenistic tradition, this was called the idle place. And it is the house of death where we idle, We are not in motion anymore when we die. It is the house of entanglement, the merging of your life with another person. And in the guidebook, I present an interesting case for why I believe pregnancy goes in the eighth house, which it is the ultimate entanglement. When you have a child with another person, there is no divorce, there is no extricating your DNA and that person's from that child, right? So I actually see pregnancy show up a lot in the eighth house. It is also just the house of your partner's stuff. Just like we talked about how the second house isn't only money, right? It's all of your resources, which can be time, which can be energy. The eighth house is going to speak to your partner's time, energy, and material and immaterial resources. The ninth house was called God. So we see a mirroring between the ninth house of God and the third house of Goddess. We're going to talk about why that is. And the ninth house is said to represent travel, foreign places, and foreign people, learning that we take on of our own volition. So whereas we saw in the third house, it's more about your early education, right? The things that are a little bit more just like you go to the school that's nearby, right? In the ninth house, you might choose to go to university in a far off place. That is a ninth house learning pursuit. It is also where we find religion and spirituality in the chart, hence the name God. And it is also where astrology and divination live as well. The 10th house was called midheaven. It is where the sun travels through at high noon. So it is the most visible part of the chart. And that is why it is assigned the significations and topics of career, of your professional pursuits, but also of your public life, of your titles, your reputation, and ultimately your praxis, which is just the work that you do. It's your craft. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that you're doing in a way that makes you money or gives you a career kind of title. It can just be the work you're doing. It's also big life events and is said to represent the mother, which is a really interesting contrast when you think about the fact that the fourth house represents the father, where the sun travels through around midnight, right? And we don't really have a way to know the paternity. However, the mother visibly carries the child, right? So you can see the belly, she gives birth. There's a way in which that is a very visible thing, maternity. But paternity, on the other hand, is a little bit more hidden. It's a little bit more behind the scenes. And obviously, in the modern age, we have ways to figure out paternity now. That was certainly not always the case. And so you can kind of see the ways that where the sun moves through the chart at different times of day, it impacts the significations that we find there. Then the 11th house was called the house of good spirit. And this was the part of the chart that was said to represent friendship, trust, hope, joy, optimism, your goals and your ambitions, community, groups, audiences. All of those things are of the nature of the 11th house. And if you remember, the 5th house was called good fortune. The 11th house falls exactly opposite of that and is called good spirit. So we have another one of those mirrorings happening here. And then we get to the 12th house, which does another one of those mirrorings. And we saw bad fortune in the 6th house, and the 12th house is called bad spirit. And this is said to represent mental health, exile, solitude, fears, loss, grief, isolation. Sometimes there can be more positive significations of the 12th, but historically it was seen as one of the harder parts of the chart. I just did an entire episode with the 12th house specialist, Joe O'Neill, on the 12th. So if you haven't watched that one or haven't listened yet, go check it out when you're done with this one, because it is truly a deep dive into the 12th house. They're releasing a guidebook on the 12th house soon. And obviously my guidebook also goes in depth about the 12th. So those are kind of some baseline significations for the houses. So hopefully you've got your keywords down in your pocket now, and we're going to talk about why they mean that. One of my favorite things about house significations is that they in large part come from the planetary joys. If you've never heard of the planetary joys before, no worries, I'm going to tell you what it means. The planetary joys are kind of an ancient astrological concept that says that each traditional planet, so one of the 7 planets, the sun, the moon, Mercury, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn, all have a favorite part of the chart to be in, a favorite house to be in. And when they are placed therein, they rejoice there. They are happier to be there. And the joys actually informed the meanings of the houses. So part of the reason that the 12th house is called bad spirit is because Saturn rejoices there. Part of the reason that the 5th house is called good fortune is because Venus rejoices there. And so we're going to go through each one of these and talk about the ways that it imbues the significations into the meanings of that part of the chart. So Mercury, our weird little guy, rejoices in the first house. I love Mercury because they just don't conform. They are of neither sect, meaning they are not diurnal in nature or nocturnal in nature. They are neither masculine nor feminine. They just don't really conform. And I love that for them. But Mercury also doesn't conform in the schema of the joys because they are the only planet who rejoices in an angular house, which is really interesting. And what better place for Mercury to rejoice than the first house of self-expression, right? How do we express ourselves? Through communication, both verbal and nonverbal, right? It is the way that you talk. It is the words that you use. It is the clothes that you wear. It is all of the ways that you are communicating to the world. This is who I am, and this is what I'm about. There's also this kind of interesting thing where in the first house, it holds our ascendant, which was the moment that we entered this world, right? We are kind of in the birthing canal, if you will, and then we are burst forth into this realm, but we were kind of straddling two different areas, right? We were straddling what came before and then what comes after, the realm of the womb versus the realm of the living and the breathing outside of the womb, the internal versus the external. And Mercury really does well in liminal spaces. And I think that's part of why Mercury rejoices here. They were one of the only planets who was said to be able to go up to the heavens and up on Mount Olympus, down here on Earth. And then it was also responsible for guiding the souls to and through the underworld after they died. So they have this ability to traverse through different realms. And in the first house, we see this quality of leaving one realm and entering another in order to be born. And so Mercury, I think, is kind of a steward of that process. And so Mercury's significations of communication, of expression, and also of being kind of a traveler between realms is part of how Mercury's significations are imbued into the first house. Now, the moon rejoices in the third house of goddess, which makes a lot of sense why it's called that now, right? It is her temple. And the moon has a lot to do with why we find our connection to the external world in the third house, right? It is the local area. It's the people we see on a regular basis, the streets we walk down on a regular basis, right? The moon has that kind of quality of presence. It's where we find ourselves. It represents not only our physical body, but also our emotions and our connections, right? It's also just what's around us, because it's where we find ourselves. And the moon, as the planet that is connected to fortune, right, has a little bit more of this fatedness to her. And in the third house, we find things in some ways that we have a little bit less control over because of this, which is really interesting, right? Like your siblings, your local area, your early education. It's kind of just where you find yourself by virtue of chance and circumstance, because you're not at an age where you get to really make a lot of decisions for yourself. And this connects really well to the lots, which if you've never heard of the lots, I am like the resident lot girly. And I did a really long episode with Chris Brennan on the astrology podcast about the lot of fortune and the lot of spirit. If you want to deep dive into that more, I also have a lecture on my site. I have a guidebook on my site. I have blog posts on my website. I've got a ton of stuff on the lots. But the lot of fortune talks about what just happens to you, and it is of the nature of the moon. It is the stuff that you cannot control. It holds your fate pattern, right? So when we think about that being the moon's lot, then we know that she is connected to the ever-changing tides of fate. And in the third house, right, where you're born into, like your siblings, your relatives, your area, all of those things you don't really control. They're a little bit more fated. And that's because the moon lives there. But she is also a connection point for us to the external world, to our internal world through the external world as well. And so I love the moon. When you think about her relationship to the third house, you start understanding why this is actually why we get communication as a third house signification, which a lot of people think tends to come from the modern thing of doing ABC houses, which is like the first house is Aries, and the second house is Taurus, and then the third house is Gemini. Because the third house is Gemini in the modern kind of framing, they give communication to the third. But the moon is the original messenger, even before Mercury, right? She is the one who transmits the influence of all the other planets to us down here in the sublunar realm. So she is constantly chatting, going from here to there, exchanging messages from other planets to us. So she has a lot to do with communication. And we see in the third house, we get like different significations of letters. We also see gossip and rumors show up in the third house. It is books and learning that we take on in more of like a short form kind of thing. It also tends to signify things that are a little bit more short-lived or ephemeral, right? It's like it's a blog post, it's a podcast, it's something that is fleeting. It is not, the magnum opus novel that we find in the ninth house. It's the blog post. And that's because the moon is moving so quickly through the zodiac that she doesn't stay in one place for very long, right? She's focused on something one day and something else the next day. So the third house also has this kind of quality of waxing and waning, thanks to the moon's joy there. Now, Venus, as I mentioned before, rejoices in the fifth house. And the fifth house, this is her whole relationship to this house is where we find romance and sex and pleasure as part of the significations of the fifth, along with children, right? Venus was said to be a feminine planet, her and the moon. And so they have a lot to do with fertility. And so the fifth house being related to children and fertility is because Venus rejoices here. She is invested in the creative, connective, relational, and beautiful sides of life. And that is what we find in the fifth house, right? She is literally called the laughter loving queen in the Orphic hymn to Venus. Like, she likes things that make you laugh, that are about joy. And that is what we find in the fifth house. It's the things we do for fun. It's what we do to relax, right? And Venus's presence in the fifth house as the planet that rejoices there imbues all of those significations into the fifth. So it's things that are a little bit more good fortune, right? It is good fortune to be able to have time to relax, to be able to have a child, to be able to find someone that you romantically connect with, right? To be able to embrace pleasure. It is a more frivolous part of the chart, and that's not to say it's less important. In fact, I think it is one of the most important parts of the chart. I did a whole guidebook and lecture with Meg Keen on the 5th and the 11th houses. We go really deep into those two as well. So maybe check that out if you are a 5th or 11th house person, because we get really into Venus being the planet that rejoices in the 5th and those two different things. Then we have Mars rejoicing in the 6th house. Mars is known to be a malefic planet, right? Malefic literally translates to evil doer. We think back to some of the significations of the 6th house, it starts making a lot of sense, right? It's illnesses and injuries and chronic illness in particular. It is unpaid labor. It is the stuff that we always have to do. It's the responsibilities, right? Parenting, caretaking for an elderly parent. It is animals that are domesticated. So it's like you're taking your dog for a walk is a 6th house kind of thing. And that's because Mars is the planet of action and energy and strife. And so it's the stuff that never stops. It's all of the things that you just have to do. Mars is really good at expending a lot of energy on things, but it can also lead you to feel not so good because you don't necessarily focus on care and comfort and nourishment. And those aren't the themes of the 6th house. They're a little bit more connected with the 2nd house versus in the 6th house, Mars is like, all right, we've got shit to do. Let's get it done. That's why I call it the grind. It's because the 6th house is a grind. It's the day in and day out labor of being a human. It's brushing your teeth and answering your emails and doing the dishes and all of the things that you have to do, not the things that you want to do. And that is why Mars rejoices here, because he gives us the ability to get that stuff done, but it also is pain. It is not easy, right? When you have a chronic illness, you are feeling like that martial feeling of difficulty and challenge and strife. And those are all things that are in the 6th house. And just like we talked about in the 12th house episode with Joe, right? Astrology is going to talk to all of life. And if your astrology only focuses on the good, then you are ignoring all of the pain and suffering that you have experienced and all of the pain and suffering that everybody else in the world experiences. And that is just not something I can get behind. right? Life is not all rainbows and butterflies and sunshine all of the time. And there are parts of the chart that speak to things that are a little bit harder. In the sixth house, we lack agency a lot of the time. And that lack of agency makes it really hard to do stuff there, makes it hard to exist as a human being in a body, right? It's just all of the shit you got to do, the sixth house stuff. And that's why it's bad fortune. It's not Venus. It's not the good stuff. It's not the pleasure and the fun and the enjoyment, right? It's like if you've got a lot of work on your plate, those are the things that actually get sacrificed, but it's not necessarily supportive to the life force to be able to just pour into all of the things you've got to do all day long and never take a second to rest, right? That's why burnout is a sixth house signification. Now, the sun rejoices in the ninth house of God. So think about the sun rejoicing in the ninth house of God and the moon rejoicing in the third house of goddess. And you have kind of like the king and the queen of the planets, opposing each other's joys, but also informing each other at the same time. And so the ninth house, the sun is very consistent, moves 1 degree per day, has a vision, has an ideal, likes to strive for that in a consistent manner. And whereas the moon is fleeting and ephemeral, like we talked about, always on to the next thing, right? Moving faster some days, slower some days, connecting to one planet one moment and the other another. And the sun is just kind of steady on its course. So the ninth house speaks to things that are more enduring and more long lasting, but also things that are a little bit more agentic, because the sun is related to the law of spirit. That is the sun's law. And we contrast that with the law of fortune, which is the things that happen to us through no volition of our own. The law of spirit is what we do choose. It is where we have agency or free will, if you believe in that sort of thing. Maybe listen to my episode on Amor Fati, which was the first episode I ever put out for my opinions on fate and free will. But the sun has a little bit more of an agentic quality to it, right? And so in the ninth house, we find things that we have more choice over, right? What do you want to study in school? Where do you want to travel if you want to travel at all? What do you believe in? What are your philosophical beliefs? What are your ethics and your morals? All of those things are ninth house topics because they're things that you have a little bit more of a choice in. You might not be able to choose the religion that you are born into or the culture that you're born into, but as you age, you can change, right? You aren't stuck in that environment. You're able to make a shift towards beliefs that align more with your soul and your core purpose. And I always say the ninth house is the house of self-discovery because the sun rejoices here. This is where we find ourselves. And when you think about all the things that we find in the ninth house, it makes a lot of sense, right? It is travel, and you learn so much about yourself and your values and your priorities. When you go to another place, it teaches you what you value about home and what you value about this new thing and new place and new culture and new experience that you are currently in. That teaches you about yourself, right? Just like going to university for the first time, you are separated from your parents if you end up going to college at all, right? And this is kind of like a time where you're allowed to explore and figure out, like, what do I want to study? What do I care about? What do I want to learn about? What do I want to major in? And that exploration, even just the experience of learning, right? It teaches you what you're interested in and what you're not interested in. And that informs your self-concept. Religion and spirituality do the same things. Astrology and divination do the same things, right? It is helping you understand your place in the world when you ask questions of the oracle, right? You're literally trying to figure out what's going to happen to you in your life to gain meaning and clarity around who you are, where you're headed next, and where you currently are in this given moment. And all of those things are solar in nature. So the sun's rejoicing here kind of brings all of its significations into the ninth house. And that's why I say it is the heart of the birth chart. Jupiter rejoices in the 11th house of good spirits. So you can see that Venus and Jupiter, the two benefic planets, their joys oppose one another, just as the sun and the moon do, which I think is like a really beautiful, like cosmic harmony sort of situation. We've got good fortune, good spirit, we've got Venus, we've got Jupiter. Now, Jupiter is a planet that is further out from us than Venus is. So it is things that are a little bit further away. It's like a less intimate space than the fifth house is, right? Whereas like the fifth house is, it's sex and it's creativity and it's children. It's stuff that is very close to you, very intimate, very exposed. The 11th house, on the other hand, like we were talking about before, it's community, right? It is groups and it's audiences and it's people who you have like-minded not necessarily beliefs, but like-minded affiliations with. Like you could be in book club with someone that's an 11th house person, right? You have a shared affiliation with that person. So you're going to connect with them over that topic, but you might not necessarily know like their mom's name, right? That's an 11th house situation. There's something that is kind of tying you two together in this Jupiter way, which is a spirit of camaraderie versus necessarily a spirit of deep, intimate connection, but there's trust and there's friendship there. And Jupiter is very focused on faith and belief and is the planet of trust and hope. And you see in ancient significations, they talk about the 11th house as being the house of hopes and dreams, right? It's like, what are you wishing for? And Jupiter is the planet of wishing. So we find a lot of jovial significations of groups and gatherings. Like I think of Jupiter as the feast, and it's like the fifth house is a picnic and the 11th house is the feast. The fifth house is the intimate kind of thing, like with just a few people, versus the 11th house is like, let's gather everyone together. It's more social, it's more externalized, and it's a little bit more, it's bigger in a way because Jupiter is bigger and it has this spirit of positivity and happiness. It uplifts us. And that is kind of because Jupiter rejoices here. Now, 12th house stuff, right, is Saturn. Talked about this in depth in the 12th house episode, but Saturn is the planet of toil, of endings, of death, of solitude, of minimalism, right? And those are all things that we find in the 12th house when we are kind of put into a darker part of the chart and forced to face our fears, to confront self-undoing, to really go deep within our psyche in a way that happens when we get quiet and removed from the hustle and bustle of daily life, which is ultimately what Saturn does. But Saturn is going to impress his influence on the 12th house in a really deep way. If you want way more on that one, go listen to the 12th house episode. So that is one of the ways that the houses get their meanings, right? So you can already see how much deeper we're going, how much more context we have. Why the third house means siblings? Well, it's like, well, that's what was around you when you were a kid. It's the stuff that you didn't really have that choice over, because the moon also speaks to things that are a little bit more faded, right? You can see why the sun was rejoicing in the ninth house is a little bit more of an agentic place, why we have a little bit more choice in that part of the chart, and why it has a lot to do with self-discovery. It's not just learning, it's not just travel. It's like, well, why is it those things? And it's because that's what gives life meaning. It's because it helps us understand our self-concept, right? It helps us understand our place in the world. It's also things that are a little bit more intellectual. And the sun is a planet of the mind, just as Mercury is. And so you can really start to get a lot deeper than baseline keywords for each of the houses just by looking at the joys. But that's not the only ways that the houses get their meanings, right? There's also something about the aspect that house forms to the ascendant that tells us a lot about what it means and how supportive it is to the life force. This is something that you see in pretty much every ancient text, and it is one of the major things that kind of helps us group the houses into good and bad houses. And that is not my way for the people that are listening to the audio version and not watching the video version. I did air quotes over good and bad houses. You have planets and quote unquote bad houses, you're not a bad person, but you probably do engage with themes that are a little bit harder because you've got placements there. It's pulling you into that part of the chart, but it's more about what is bad for us rather than what is good for us, right? Sixth house stuff, like we talked about, chronic illness is not good for us, right? So the sixth house is thought of to be a bad house. And one of the reasons for that is because the sixth house does not make an aspect to the ascendant. And the ascendant, we find the self, we find health, we find the body, we find vitality, pneuma, right? And when you don't have something connected to those things, it is said to be disconnected from the life force and therefore less supportive to the self, which makes it worse in our subjective lived experience. So you want to think about the aspects that these different houses form to the ascendant, and that is going to tell you a lot about how good and supportive it is or how challenging it is. So there are the angular houses, which are the first, fourth, seventh, and 10th. Those all aspect each other either through squares or through oppositions. And they are said to be the most powerful and active parts of the chart. Now, that is going to tell you something about the relationship that those areas of life have to one another, but we can also look at the aspects formed to the first house from other parts of the chart. Like the 11th house and the third house are in sextiles to the first house of self. The 11th house is thought to be better, quote unquote, because it is an overcoming sextile to the first house, which means it is above the first house. So it has more of an influence on the first house than we find in the third. So it is more supportive than the third house. But sextiles are of the nature of Venus. They're thought to be supportive aspects. And so having a supportive aspect tells us that those things are supportive to our life force, right? Like your local area and your habits and your rituals and your practices, those are all things that are supportive to you as a person, supportive to your self-concept and potentially to your health and your body and your well-being. The 11th house, joy, friendship, community, all of those things are supported to you as a person, and that's where we get that sextile aspect being one that is said to be a little bit more positive. Then we have trines, which are the nature of Jupiter. And so the houses that trine the first house are also said to be very supportive because Jupiter is a benefic planet. And so those things are going to have an easy, kind of flowing, harmonious relationship with the first house. So the ninth house, for example, and the fifth house both trine the first. So those are thought to be more positive houses, which gives them more positive significations, right? Like we find romance and hobbies and pleasure and children in the fifth house because those are things that are more supportive to the life force, right? When you are happy, when you are doing things that bring you joy, your well-being is in a better condition than when you are not engaging in those areas of life. So that trine shows this underlying dynamic of fifth house topics being supportive to the self that we find in the first house, and similarly with the ninth. So the aspect to the ascendant is also one of the ways that we get meanings for the houses. And the aspect is literally referring to sight. Comes from the Latin word aspectus, which means to look at. If it is looking at that first house, if it can see it, then it has an ability to inform it, but it also has an ability to support it. And that is where aversions are more difficult because they do not see the first house, which means they have more difficult themes attached to them because they are quite literally unsupportive to the life force. The houses that are averse to the first are the 12th, are the 8th, are the 6th, and are the 2nd. The 2nd is kind of a special case for reasons that we're going to get into. But the other one's quite difficult, right? Like the 8th house of death is not, on a baseline supportive to the life force. It is quite literally the end of the life force, at least in one context. The 6th house of chronic illness and injuries, right, of labor, especially unpaid labor. Those are things that are not supportive to the life force. Burnout, not supportive to the life force. 12th house, self-undoing, bad mental health, right? Conditions and stuff like that, suffering from depression, suffering from loss, going through a big period of grief, exiling yourself. All of those things are not supportive to the life force. And that's because it cannot see the first house. And so there's going to be this sense that those aversions are places where we lack agency because we can't see what's going on in there. You can't see something, you can't control it, you can't have a say in it. And it is going to make it a lot harder to manage it. And that is going to create difficulty in our lives, which is why those houses are thought of as being a little bit harder. In the guidebook, I give you the full breakdown of like which houses in order are thought to be the most supportive and which ones are thought to be the least supportive. So you can check that out if you want to know more. So next we move into this concept of angularity, right? There are angular houses, there are succedent houses, and there are cadent houses. And these all have different kind of qualities attached to them. So the angular houses are the 1st, the 4th, the 7th, and the 10th. And those are thought of as like the stakes of life. They are the most powerful and active places, which really in ancient times just meant they were conducive to doing business in the world, right? It's not that other parts of the chart are inherently not good because they're not angular, but they didn't necessarily help us get out into the world, make money, make a name for ourselves, support our families, all of those things. And so these angular houses are going to express the most prominently in the life, because if you think about the topics that are ascribed to them, they are kind of the foundations of the life and the foundations of the chart. It is self and health, body, right, in the first house, family and your living situation, your home, the fourth house, your relationships and your partnerships in the seventh house, and your praxis, the work you do, in the 10th, right? So there is this kind of quality that when you think about the big areas of life, it is probably your health, your home and your family, your relationships, and your career, the work that you do out in the public eye, right? And then there's other areas of life, but something changes in one of those, everything else in your life kind of shifts as a result, right? Angles were called pivots or stakes because they pivot things into motion. They stir us into action. You change careers, your whole life changes, right? You change relationships, that can change a lot of things in your life as well. You move to a different place, that's going to change a lot of things. You get really, really ill, that's going to change a lot of things, right? So the first, fourth, seventh, and 10th tend to be thought of as the most powerful, most active parts of the chart. Then we have succedent houses, and succedent houses rise up to the angular houses. So I'm going to just show a chart so we can look at what this actually looks like in a chart. In the video version, this will be a little bit more helpful. If you are listening, I'm going to do my best to explain it anyway. So the succedent houses are the second, the fifth, the eighth, and the 11th. And what they are said to do is rise up to the angular house. So for example, the 11th house is rising up to the 10th. It is supporting the topics that we find in that part of the chart. The 8th house is rising up to the 7th and supporting the topics we find there. The 5th house is rising up to the 4th and supporting the topics we find there. And the 2nd is rising up and supporting the topics we find in the 1st, which is why the 2nd is actually inherently a little bit more supportive to the life force than the 12th, the 8th, and the 6th that don't see the 1st house through aspect. Because even though the 2nd house doesn't see the 1st house, it sits beneath it. It rises up to it. It succeeds it. So there's something inherently supportive about that part of the chart to the self that we find in the 1st house. So these succedent houses were thought of as being a little bit more aspirational in nature. Like you are reaching for something, you are striving for something. So they're more hopeful, they're more optimistic in that way. They are less active than angular houses, but they are more active than cadent houses. And cadent houses are where they fall away from an angle. And this is the 3rd, the 6th, the 9th, and the 12th. So these parts of the chart were thought to be very inactive, not conducive for doing business, right? Which makes sense. Like all of the cadent houses are associated with travel, for example. And in the ancient world, travel was usually not a good thing. It was pretty dangerous, so it was not something that you wanted to be doing. This wasn't like hopping on a flight to go to the Maldives and like have a cheeky fun time, right? Like this was like putting your life in danger. And so all of those things were thought to be unsupportive, right? Of not conducted to doing business in the world, right? They're all things that take you out and away from society in one context or another, besides, I would say, kind of the 3rd, a little bit less so. So when we think about the sequence, right, the 2nd house rises up to the angular 1st house, and then the 12th house falls away from it. So the 12th house is thought to be more negative because it is literally, you are leaving that 1st house of self, you are falling away from it. So it is inherently less supportive. The 11th house rises up to the 10th, which is with an angular part of the chart. Like you can think about how, for example, your friends can help you get a job in the 10th house, right? Like your greater network that we find in the 11th can support and elevate and uplift the 10th house that we find that is connected to your professional pursuits some of the time. And then the 9th house is where we fall away from that, right? So we are kind of leaving the 10th house, the active part of the chart, but because the 9th house is in a trine to the 1st, it's still thought to be pretty good. But the 9th house is also where you go to learn. It's where you go to travel. It's, it kind of takes you away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life because you're usually not working when you're in the 9th house, right? Like if, maybe less so modern times where we actually do have to work when we go to study. Normally, if you were studying before at college or university, you weren't working a full-time job. You know what I mean? And so that's kind of like it takes you out of the activity of the 10th because you are, you're worshiping God in the 9th house. You're going on a pilgrimage in the 9th house. You're studying or learning something in the 9th house. It's less active in that way. Then we have the 8th house rising up to the 7th house, which is angular, and the 6th house falls away from that. So the 6th house is thought to be less supportive because it is a cadent house, right? Your partner's resources that we find in the eighth house, their time, their energy, their money, that supports and uplifts the relationship that we find in the seventh. And then, the conditions of life, the work, the labor, all those things in the sixth house are kind of where we fall away from that angularity and things become a little bit more difficult. Then we have the fifth house, which rises up to and supports the angular fourth house. And then the third house falls away from that. So the third house was also thought to be cadent, but because of the sextile that is formed between the third and the first, it's a little bit more supportive, even though it is a cadent house. I know this is a lot of information. I know I just threw so much at you, especially if you've only ever thought about the houses as keywords. But I'm hoping that by starting to break these things down, you can understand why the houses mean what they mean, right? It's not just that we decided that the 10th house was career. It's not that we just decided that the fifth house was children, right? It is because Venus rejoices there. It is because it forms a trine aspect to the ascendant. It is because it is a succedent house, right? It is aspirational in nature. It elevates the fourth house that we find that is more angular. So all of these things contribute to the meanings of the houses, along with what time of day the sun travels through them, right? All of those things are going to be part of this. Now, the final thing, which is really my secret sauce, what I've been building up to this whole time, is the aspects between houses. So the aspects between the houses themselves, right? We kind of looked at this in the context of the first house, right? We just talked about the fifth house trining the first house and how the things that we find in the fifth are supportive to the self that we find in the first, for example, right? That is the kind of basis, the textual basis, the traditional basis for what I present in the guidebook, which is looking at the aspects that are formed between every single house to kind of really reveal the underlying dynamics that we find in life. So think about a couple things, right? Like the sextiles are of the nature of Venus, the trines are of the nature of Jupiter, squares are of the nature of Mars, and oppositions are of the nature of Saturn. So squares in particular between different houses are going to show up in a very pronounced way because Mars is the planet of action and energy. So squares between houses can represent tension points, can represent obstacles or difficulty between two different house topics, but can also represent opportunities, catalysts for action, something that propels you from one part of the chart to another part of the chart. So I'm just going to give you a couple different examples of how this plays out. And then we will let this be because I know that this was a very technical podcast, which is kind of different from what we've been doing so far. But let me give you the example between the fourth house and the seventh house. So we talked about the fourth house being related to your living situation, to your family, to your private life, to your father, and the seventh house being related to partnerships of all kinds, whether those are romantic, whether those are open enemies, etc. So your fourth house situation, your living situation, the land that you inhabit, the country that you come from, that has an overwhelming influence on the kinds of partners that you can find in the seventh house. That is the nature of the overcoming square. So when the square is overcoming, which is a little bit hard to explain. I explained it in the guidebook, but you can see that if you were to consider the seventh house, I'm showing graphics, which you might want to watch this part on the video version. If this is not making sense to you through me attempting to explain this verbally right now, I'm much better in writing. If you take the seventh house and pretend that it is the first house, right? Then the fourth house would be the 10th house from the seventh house, right? Like you're in the seventh house, this becomes your first house. It's like second house, third house, fourth house, fifth house, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th. And the 10th house is above the seventh house. You can look at this very easily when you're looking at the first house. The 10th house is above the first house. The 11th house is above the first house. So because it is above that part of the chart, it has an overwhelming influence on the topics that we find there. And so, for example, the fourth house is squaring the seventh, but it's also in an overcoming square to the seventh because it is 10th from that house, from that perspective. And so the fourth house, your location, right? It determines the types of people that you can meet. Normally we marry people from the same country as us, and if they are not in the country that we come from, that we hail from, They are usually in the country where we are residing, right? You aren't usually meeting people that live across the globe and trying to make that relationship work, which is another way that the square shows up between the fourth house of living situation and the seventh house of partners. Long distance relationships create conflict and tension in the seventh house partnership. So you can see that the square is a tension aspect, right? It creates difficulty or obstacles or catalysts of action between two parts of the chart. So where you live is going to impact the relationships that you have. It's going to impact the people that you meet. Being in a long distance relationship might also cause you to move, right? If someone is in a different place, then all of a sudden your living situation changes as a result of the partnership. This is how these two parts of the chart are talking to one another. Another way that historically and in some cultures this still plays out today is through arranged marriages. So the fourth house represents our family, usually our parents and our grandparents, who are typically the people that are responsible for organizing arranged marriages, right? They are literally picking the person you're going to marry. So that overcoming square having an overwhelming influence, the fourth overwhelms the seventh. All of a sudden, the family that we find in the fourth house has the ability to choose the spouse of the person you're going to marry. So you can see that the fourth house has a massive influence on the seventh. There's also conflict that exists between these things. It is a trope that you hate your in-laws, right? And Mars is the planet of conflict and anger. And we can see that there is inherent tension between the fourth house of family and the seventh house of spouse and partner. Now, this is referring to underlying chart dynamics, underlying dynamics of life, right? If you have the ruler of your fourth house in a trine to the ruler of the seventh house, then your folks might get along with your partner really, really well. You know, that might not be a problem for you because the way that those ruling planets are aligned in your chart is more supportive of the relationship. But when we take out the context of your chart and we're just thinking about a chart, this is literally the dynamics that go between, you know, the fourth house of family and the seventh house of partnership. It is very common for, especially you know, like a husband or a would-be husband to ask the father for permission to marry their daughter, right? That is the square between the fourth and the seventh house. There is an exchange happening here, which was quite literally the nature of what marriage used to be in the ancient world, which was a property exchange of the woman between father and husband. So historically, there's actually a lot of context between the square between the fourth and the square between the seventh as well, you know, in a way that is really, I think, difficult for a lot of us to think about today, especially myself. I never want to think of another person as property. That was how women were thought of for a very long time. And you can see that there was like this exchange happening between father and husband as the woman was exchanged. That was the, you know, the father walking the bride down the aisle. That is the nature of the square, right? It's like this transaction thing happening. It is a relationship between two parts of the chart that creates an overwhelming influence from one to the other, right? The father hands over to the husband. And so you can see that the father has more of the influence in this dynamic than the partner would, you know, and that partner would probably be chosen or approved of by the father before the marriage could take place. So this is the story of the fourth and the seventh house, but you don't get that story if you're not thinking about the aspect between the fourth and the seventh. But you can see, I just listed maybe 5 different ways that that dynamic plays out, right? It's not just like, oh, you know, family is related to partnership, but you know, family is related to partnership in a lot of different ways. And so is your location. So is your home, right? You move in with someone that could make or break the relationship. That's another way that the square between the fourth and the seventh house plays out. So that is one way. You could also think about the square between the seventh and the 10th, right? So the seventh house is in the overcoming square. It is 10th from the 10th. So it is going to have an overwhelming influence on the topics that we find in the 10th house of career and reputation. We can think about this maybe from a less romantic lens and through the lens of open enemies, because I love to think about, you know, maybe the less thought of ways of approaching these houses and the dynamics between them. And let's just take this back to the summer of 2024, the rap battle that ignited between Kendrick Lamar and Drake. Right? The open enemies that we found in the seventh house. They had a huge rap battle. They exposed each other's secrets. They went back and forth. And one of them came out on top, right? The open enemy that Drake had of Kendrick Lamar had an overwhelming influence on Drake's reputation going forward, right? After all of those songs dropped, the way the entire public thought about Drake was completely changed. His reputation is forever different now because your open enemies have a massive influence on the way that other people perceive you, or they can when that square gets activated. And I think Kendrick Lamar was having really intense activations of his 10th house at that time. And so you can see the ways in which this is really starting to paint a picture that the square, the conflict between your open enemy and your career, your reputation, right? It can create tension in your life, but it also has the ability to make or break the public perception of you. And when we want to think about this in a more romantic context, when you're considering making a big move professionally, a big life change that maybe isn't professional at all, usually you consult seventh house people, either your romantic partner, your best friends, right? You start asking them, like, what do you think about this? Is this a good move for me? Can you see me in this role? And if they say no, I don't think that you should go for it, that can have an overwhelming influence on whether or not you go for that promotion, whether or not you apply for a new job, right? Because those trusted people have the ability to be an obstacle towards different career paths for you, or to be a catalyst for action for you to go after those things. That's the nature of the square. So the seventh house and the 10th house are intimately related, just like the fourth house and the seventh house are. And you can do this between every house in the chart, not just with squares. You can do it with trines. You can do it with sextiles. You can do it with oppositions. You can think about how the 11th house of friendship isn't an overcoming square to the second house of consumption. And this is like the peer pressure aspect, which I talk about in the guidebook, right? Like your friends literally trying to get you to drink or something. That is built into the chart, right? That is built into the square, the overcoming square that your friends are in, to the things that you consume in the second house. It can be things that kind of feel like givens or like funny almost, is that the chart speaks to all of life, and the aspects between the houses talk about these dynamics that we all encounter at different points in our lives. You know, you think about why it's so hard to share your work with the world. That's because the 8th house of fears and anxiety and anguishes of the mind is in an overcoming square to the 11th. So it becomes an obstacle for you to put yourself out there in the 11th house because you are fearing and you are stressing in the 8th. And that square can also be, you know, a kind of difficult thing that prevents you then from making friends or sharing your work with the world, sharing your creations with the world, right? And you can also do this with, you know, things that aren't squares. Like you can think about the trine between the 5th and the 9th house, and how the 9th house is religion and the 5th house is children, and how a lot of religions encourage you to have children. Trines are harmonious, flowing relationships that create ease and kind of harmony between two areas of life. So certain religions are going to say, no, you should procreate, you should have children, right? That's the trine between the 9th and the 5th. You think about the trine between the 9th and the 1st, like we talked about already, right? That going out in the world, exploring, traveling, learning, understanding what you believe in politically, philosophically, religiously, spiritually, it helps you feel good. It helps your well-being, and it helps your self-expression and understanding your core priorities, because there is a harmony between 9th house topics and 1st house topics, right? So you can do this with every part of the chart. And that is exactly what I did in the Houses Guidebook, which is out now. You can go get it. It's on my website, www.kirareiberg.com. Click the guidebook button on the top kind of menu, and you will find the Houses Guidebook right there, ready for purchase. I hope that you love it. I put so much love into this thing, so much energy into this thing. I've been writing this, you know, almost unintentionally since 2022, when I started my articles on the houses for my patrons. And over the years, this grew and grew and grew. And now it is a 193 page guidebook that is really more of a book, but I just don't have a publisher. So you can get it for immediate download by purchasing it on my website today. I hope you liked this episode. I hope that even though it was technical, we didn't get too lost in the sauce, and that you were able to gain a lot deeper understanding of why the houses mean what they mean. I'm hoping that going forward, we'll still do deep dives on each of the houses on the channel. I loved doing that episode with Joe, and I would love to bring kind of a specialist on for each house to have similar conversations. So if that's something you guys would like to see, let me know in the comments down below. Make sure you like this video, subscribe, buy the guidebook, tell your friends, and I will catch you in the next one. Thanks for listening. Bye.